The archive station was old, ancient, really so old that the walls groaned even in the silence of deep space, where there was no wind to push them and no reason for the sound to exist. The lights inside flickered every few minutes. It wasn't because something was broken, but simply because the station had been running for so long that even its electrical systems were weary. Tessali didn't mind the flickering. Most of her academic life had been spent in dim and strange places. She had 4 eyes, 2 large ones in front and 2 smaller ones on the sides of her wide, flat head, and all 4 were perfectly adapted for reading in low light. It was one of the small advantages of being a Tonka in a galaxy full of species that required bright rooms and loud machines for comfort. She sat on a narrow chair in front of a terminal older than her grandmother, scrolling through one file after another of cartographic data. Her fingers moved quickly. Her 2 front eyes were fixed on the screen. Her 2 side eyes wandered the room out of habit, searching for nothing in particular. She was supposed to be here for routine work, the Cartographers Guild conclave. The organization that had hired her as an intern had sent her to this decommissioned archive station on the edge of the DNVA system to recover old survey files and migrate them to a new central database. It was boring work. It was the kind of work given to interns because it was tedious, and no senior cartographer wanted to spend 3 weeks drifting on a dead station. While copying files, Tessali didn't complain. She liked old things, she liked quiet places, and most of all, she liked the feeling of discovering something unexpected where nothing interesting was supposed to be. She found it on the 9th day. The file was buried under 12 layers of standard archival data dust accumulation reports, gravitational drift logs, and standard star mapping files that hadn't been opened in over 200 years. She almost missed it. Her finger was already moving to the next folder when something caught the attention of her lower left eye. The file name didn't match the others. Everything else had long system codes full of numbers and strings. This file had a name. It was called Primary Survey. Original. Do not move. Do not copy. Do not read. Tessali stared at it for a moment. She read it. In her defense, anyone would have. The file took nearly 4 minutes to open. The station's processor was old, and the file itself was enormous, far larger than any survey document had the right to be. When it finally loaded, Tessali leaned forward without thinking. Her front eyes widened. It was a map, but it looked nothing like any map in the conclave's current database. The map she worked with every day had an empty gray area on the outer edge of the western spiral arm. Every map had it. It simply existed like a hole in the page, and no one really talked about it. The designation along its border stated that the region was unexplored and that access for surveyors had been suspended in accordance with what was called Conclave Directive Prima. Tessali had seen this designation hundreds of times. It had never interested her. Many regions were unexplored. Space is big. But on this map, this old, hidden, forbidden-to-read map, there was no gray area. There were stars, hundreds of them. Bright, detailed, fully mapped stars with names and coordinates, population data, atmospheric readings, and notes on resources and trade potential. The stellar geography of an entire civilization, mapped with meticulous detail by surveyors who had clearly spent an enormous amount of time and effort to do their work properly. And in the center of all these stars, in letters that were bold, clear, and had clearly survived several attempts at deletion that had all somehow failed, were 2 words: human space. Tessali leaned back in her chair. She stared at the screen for a long time without moving. Then she looked over her right shoulder, then her left. She checked both side views out of pure reflex, even knowing the room was empty and there were no other occupants on the station. She looked at the screen again. Human space, she whispered into the void. The station hummed and flickered. She didn't close the file. She knew she should have. The file had 3 clear warnings, and one of them contained the word forbidden in 4 different languages. Tessali had always had a complicated relationship with warnings. She respected them the way a person respects a very large dog. She took them seriously. She didn't provoke them mindlessly, but she also didn't walk away without understanding what she was dealing with. She began to read. The survey data was old, older than she had expected. Some of it dated back more than 1,000 years to the early expansion period, when the conclave was still young and its member species were just learning to work together and map the galaxy using shared tools. The earliest records were simple. Several reconnaissance probes sent to the western spiral arm returned data on a yellow star and a small rocky system orbiting it. Standard findings, nothing alarming. Then the records changed. A probe sent to the third planet of the yellow star discovered something unexpected. Radio signals, structured in a way that only comes from sentient beings. This wasn't unusual in the early conclave era. New species were discovered regularly. The surveyors logged it with professional enthusiasm and marked it for the First Contact Protocol. The First Contact Protocol sent a larger ship. This ship returned with a report that Tessali read before she was sure she understood it correctly. The species on the third planet, calling itself humanity and its planet Earth, was friendly. It was curious. It wanted to communicate and did so quickly and well, once both sides developed a common language. They didn't yet have faster-than-light drives, but their people were clearly intelligent, and their technology was rapidly evolving. There was no problem there. The problem was everything else the surveyors found, because Earth, they reported, was not what any of them expected. It wasn't the technology that confused the early surveyors. Humanity's technology was young by galactic standards, interesting, sometimes creative, but nothing that could threaten a conclave research vessel. It wasn't the size of the human population, which was large for a single-planet species but not extraordinary. It was the wars. Humanity, the surveyors reported, using the careful, measured language that people use when they are trying very hard not to sound frightened, had been at war with itself throughout its entire documented history. Not minor conflicts, not border disputes between cities or states. The research team had gained access to humanity's historical records, and what they found in those records was something most research teams never encountered in a first contact mission. Humanity fought wars that spanned the entire surface of its planet. They developed weapons capable of destroying all life on Earth, and then, at least a dozen times throughout their history, they decided not to use them, not because they couldn't, but because they chose not to. This distinction was noted in the surveyor's log with 3 exclamation points, which was unusual for a professional document. Humans healed from wounds that would have killed most species, not because they had extraordinary medicine, though they were developing medicine quickly, but because their bodies, according to the research team's biology specialist, were stubbornly difficult to stop. A human could lose a large amount of blood and still function. They could withstand temperatures that would incapacitate most conclave species. They could go without sleep or food for periods that the biology specialist described as genuinely alarming. They also ran from nothing, though they did that too, but for no reason, just for the sake of movement, sometimes over very long distances across very difficult terrain. The biology specialist spent 6 pages of the report trying to explain this and eventually gave up, writing, "It seems they like it. I have no better explanation." Tessali scrolled page after page. Hours passed unnoticed. The early research team did not recommend conquest, nor did they recommend avoidance. They recommended careful, slow contact, allow humanity to develop, observe its growth, introduce it to the conclave gradually, in stages, giving it time to get used to the knowledge that it was not alone in the universe. It was a good recommendation, a reasonable one, the kind given by experienced people when they have carefully considered a situation. It was never implemented. Instead, 200 years after the first contact file was written, another document appeared shorter, more formal, written in the dry, official language of a conclave administrative decree. It was the original text of Directive 1 Prima, and it stated in general terms the following: all reconnaissance activity in the Western Spiral Arm, designated as human space, is to be suspended indefinitely. No conclave vessel is to cross the border of human space without direct permission from the Conclave High Council. All existing maps of human space are to be reclassified and removed from public circulation. The region will be marked as unexplored on all standard maps. No explanations, no incident reports, no reasons, just a directive signed by 17 members of the High Council, each of whom wrote their signature with such firm, deliberate pressure that it suggested they were very confident in what they were doing. Tessali looked for an explanation in the archive and found something almost worse instead. Nothing. No records of what happened, no incident reports, just a void, a clean, intentional, carefully maintained void where the reason should have been. Who had deleted it? Deleted it so completely that even the deletion itself had been erased. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her hands to her face, which was what Tonkas did when they were overwhelmed. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the map. The map didn't answer. The lights flickered. The station hummed. The next 2 days she spent going through everything in the archive that had even the slightest relation to the Western Spiral Arm, or anything that might have triggered Directive 1 Prima. She found fragments, parts of things. An old diplomatic message from a species called the Bretts, which mentioned recent actions at the outer edge of the arm without specifying what. Navigational data updates that redirected 3 major trade lines away from human space without explanation, other than a reference to a number leading to a file that no longer existed. A scientific paper on biology from a conclave medical university that cited research on human physiology. The citation was still there, but the research itself had been deleted. It was like reading a book from which someone had cut out all the pages containing the most important parts of the story. But there were small things that remained perhaps accidentally, perhaps because whoever was doing the purging had grown tired or careless toward the end. A surveyor's personal journal, attached to an otherwise empty administrative file. One paragraph in a diplomatic note that survived because it was buried at the bottom of a much longer document about something entirely different. The journal entry belonged to a surveyor named Celtivar and dated back about 800 years, long after the issuance of Directive 1 Prima. It read, "Passed near the border today. Didn't cross, no one crosses, but I saw 2 ships from the observation deck. Long, heavy things with shapes that don't match anything in the construction catalog. They didn't initiate contact, didn't approach us. They just stood on their side of the line, watching. I asked the captain if we should report them. She said we should look away, set a course for Drenvor, and never speak of it again. So I'm writing this instead, because I don't think things that are real should disappear just because someone is afraid of them." Tessali read the entry 3 times. The paragraph in the diplomatic note was shorter, written by an ambassador whose name had been redacted, addressed to the Conclave Trade Committee about 300 years ago. It stated only, "I strongly recommend no further economic action directed toward human space. We do not fully understand what we are dealing with, and I don't think we want to. Some borders are drawn not by walls, but by wisdom. This is one of them." On the 3rd day, Tessali did what she had been putting off because she knew it would make everything harder to ignore. She cross-referenced the star data from the hidden map with the current public maps. The calculation took her terminal almost the entire morning. When it finished, the results lay on her screen in simple numbers, very easy to understand. Human space, according to the original survey data, contained 412 star systems. Most of them had planets. Many of these planets were marked in the old surveys as habitable or capable of being inhabited, or already showing signs of development. Humanity had been a spacefaring species for at least several centuries by now. Judging by the development timeline in the first contact files, 412 systems, an entire civilization sitting right there on the western edge of the known galaxy, behind the gray area on the map, while the rest of the conclave lived its daily life and, quietly, carefully, collectively refused to look. Tessali saved a copy of the original map to a personal drive, hid the drive in the inner pocket of her work jacket, and then sat for a long time thinking about what she would do next. The reasonable, safe thing would be to finish the transfer, pack her tools, submit a standard report, return to the conclave's central station, and never in her life mention the archive file to anyone. She thought of the surveyor Celtivar, who wrote things down because they deserved to be real. She thought of the clean, intentional void where the reason for Directive 1 Prima should have been. She thought of the 412 stars and the civilization living among them, which the rest of the galaxy had without any meeting quietly agreed to simply pretend didn't exist. She closed the terminal, she packed her tools, she submitted the standard report. She kept the drive in her pocket on the way back to the central conclave station, and she began to ask questions. The first thing Tessali learned after she started asking questions cautiously, quietly, as she had learned to ask when she wanted answers and not just polite refusals, was that she wasn't the only one who knew. There were others, a few, and they didn't speak openly, but they existed. Senior cartographers who had noticed the gray area and had been told to leave it alone. Historians who found fragments of old archival records and quietly tucked them away instead of reporting them. A retired conclave diplomat who had served near the Western Arm at the beginning of her career, and who, when Tessali found her, sat opposite her in a small tea-house on Station Viraf and asked a cautious question, froze for a moment, and then said, "You found the archive file?" "Yes," Tessali replied. The old diplomat looked out the window of the tea house at the dock bay beyond, where ships came and went in the routine of a busy station. She remained silent for a long time. "So you know there are stars behind the gray area?" she finally asked. "Yes. And you want to know why we don't go there?" "Yes." The old diplomat looked at her with the expression of a person who had been cautious about something for a very long time and was now weighing in real time. "Is it worth it to stop being cautious?" "I can tell you what I know," she said. "But first, I want you to understand something. What I know is not the whole story. What anyone knows is not the whole story. The whole story is behind that gray area, and it has been there for 800 years, and the reason no one went there is not that they couldn't." She paused. "It's because every time someone seriously thought about it, someone else in the room who was older, wiser, and had seen more of the galaxy would look at them quietly and say, 'I wouldn't,' and that had always been enough." Tessali leaned forward. "But why?" she asked. "What is there that scares an entire galaxy into silence?" The old diplomat raised her cup of tea. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question, and I am very sorry to tell you that answering it will take more courage than both of us might have." She drank. The station hummed around them. Somewhere outside, a ship was preparing for launch, refueling its engines, preparing to head off to somewhere mapped, known, and safe. Tessali kept her hands very still on the table and thought about the drive in her pocket and the 412 stars that were waiting in the gray area for someone brave enough to look. The old diplomat's name was Sonora, and she had seen more of the galaxy than most people twice her age. She had worked on frontier stations, led trade negotiations, and conducted quiet diplomatic missions that were never recorded in official reports because they went in ways no one wanted to explain afterward. She had white ridges along the back of her head that paled when she was nervous, and throughout her first conversation with Tessali, they were very pale. She didn't tell Tessali everything at once. Sonora didn't work that way. She spoke in layers, like someone carefully removing an old bandage from a wound, watching the wincing slowly, adjusting the speed based on what she saw. The first layer was this. The gray area had a name among senior diplomats. They called it the quiet border. Not human space, not an unexplored region, not anything that appeared in official documents. Just the quiet border, spoken in quiet voices in private rooms, always with a small pause before and after the words, as if one were pronouncing the name of something they respected enough to treat with caution. "Why quiet?" Tessali asked. "Because nothing loud ever came out of it," Sonora said. "No broadcasts, no territorial claims, no aggressive movements, no demands. Total silence on their part, and total silence on ours by agreement." She tilted her head, though I always thought the name was slightly inaccurate. Silence implies peace. In reality, it means both sides are very intentionally not making noise. "Both sides," Tessali repeated. "That is, they know about us. They know we are here." Sonora looked at her with a look that said this was perhaps the most obvious question she had ever been asked. Of course they know. They have known for centuries. They were the ones who discovered the Conclave's early reconnaissance probes. Their astronomers identified our ships before our ships identified their planet. She paused. They just decided, like we did, not to make it an official event. "Why?" "That," Sonora said, "is what I am going to try to explain to you. And I want you to understand that I am not entirely sure my explanation is correct. I am only sure it is the closest to the truth I have found." She began with the Bretts. The Bretts today were not a major power in the Conclave. They occupied a modest set of star systems in the Eastern Arm, were known mostly for their shipbuilding industry, and participated in Conclave politics with the quiet, unremarkable efficiency of a species that had learned the hard way not to reach too far. But 800 years ago, the Bretts were the dominant military force in the known galaxy. They had the largest fleet, the most advanced weapons, the most aggressive foreign policy, and they had centuries ago decided that the Western Spiral Arm, including everything in the gray area, belonged to them. The Brett fleet that crossed into human space numbered 4,000 warships. Tessali had read a fragment about this in the archive, but Sonora had more details, obtained from sources she refused to name and documents she described only as very old and very private. The fleet crossed the border with a clear mission: explore, claim, and if necessary, conquer. The Bretts were experienced in this. They had done it 6 times before with other species and other regions, and it had always worked in their favor because the Bretts were disciplined, organized, and possessed more firepower than anything they had ever encountered. What happened next was recorded by the only Brett ship that returned. The humans did not have a fleet of comparable size. They had fewer ships, older ones, and by all technical metrics, significantly less developed than what the Bretts brought. By any reasonable military calculation, they should have simply lost. They didn't lose. What the Brett records described in language that, according to Sonora, became increasingly strange and agitated as the account progressed, was that humans simply didn't behave the way an outnumbered force should behave. They didn't retreat to defensive positions, and they didn't seek terms. They didn't surrender when their losses became serious. They didn't follow any of the tactical patterns on which the Brett military strategists built their models, because all those models were based on the assumption that at some point, the losing side would accept the fact that it was losing. Humans didn't accept it. They fought in small groups and large groups. They adapted their tactics in the middle of a battle, sometimes in ways the Brett commanders described as having no logical sense, and then, 3 hours later, turning out to be terrifyingly sensible. When one approach didn't work, they tried something else. When their ships were damaged, they kept the damaged ships in the fight instead of withdrawing them. When their pilots were exhausted, they fought exhausted. Sonora paused here and looked closely at Tessali. The Brett Admiral's personal log was part of the document I read. He wasn't an emotional man. He had fought in 7 campaigns and was famous for his cool-headed judgment. But there is a section in his log, written on the 6th day of the conflict, where he describes watching one human vessel, small, heavily damaged, one of its main engines, clearly dead, continuing to maneuver and fight, refusing to retreat or go silent. And he wrote, "I do not understand what makes it move by all my measures. It should have stopped, but it didn't. It won't stop. I'm beginning to think it won't stop until there is nothing left of it. War shouldn't work this way." The fleet retreated after 3 months, Sonora continued. They lost over 3,000 ships. Humanity lost proportionally more because they had fewer to start with, but they were still fighting when the Bretts turned back. Still fighting. She let that hang for a moment. The surviving Brett ship reached home, carrying survivors and a note, a physical note on real paper, written by hand. It read, and I have memorized it because I believe it is one of the most important sentences ever written in galactic history. "We have returned your people. Please do not do this again. From Earth." The tea house was very quiet. Outside, ships moved in the dock bay, going about their usual business. "Please do not do this again," Tessali said quietly. "A threat," Sonora said. "Not a demand. Not a declaration of war or a list of conditions, just a request. Polite, almost gentle." She raised her cup of tea, found it empty, and set it down again. The Bretts never returned, and when other species learned what had happened, and that always spreads, even when everyone tries to keep it secret, they decided one by one that the western spiral arm was perhaps a part of the galaxy not worth exploring. The second story was about the Soul Trade Collective, and it was of a different nature, but in a sense even more disturbing. The souls were traders. They weren't interested in conquest. Their interest lay in control, especially the kind of control that came from managing the flow of goods and resources across large regions of space. When they identified human space as a region they didn't control, their response wasn't military, it was commercial. They simply redirected all trade lines that passed near human space, cut off any conclave vessel that tried to conduct business in the Western Arm, and sent quiet notifications to their partners, suggesting that trade in that direction would be commercially unfeasible. This, as Sonora explained, was a very sophisticated economic chokehold, the kind the souls had used before to bring entire systems into their commercial network. It worked through isolation, cut a region off from trade, watch its economy weaken, and eventually, they will come to you. The Sol embargo on human space lasted 6 months. During those 6 months, humanity didn't weaken. Instead, according to Sonora, it did something that was deeply confusing to everyone watching. Humans looked at the disruption of their trade and treated it as a problem to be solved, not as a crisis to be survived. Within 2 months, they had created their own internal trade network across their 400 star systems, faster and better organized than the fragmented one they had before, because the embargo forced them to sit down and actually build something solid. Within 4 months, they had identified conclave worlds that were also poorly served by Sol trade routes and found ways to offer them better terms not through aggression, but simply by being cheaper, faster, and more reliable. In 6 months, They were undercutting Sol prices on 12 major worlds, and the Sols went from strangling human space to watching their own market share quietly disappear in the Western Arm. They ended the embargo without announcement or explanation. They just stopped, redirected their trade lines back to where they were, and began a period of quiet internal reorganization, which their economic historians would later describe as a necessary calibration. Tessali almost smiled. They had tried to strangle humans economically, and the humans had accidentally improved their own economy in the process. Not accidentally, Sonora said, and she didn't smile. That is what you must understand. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a coincidence. Every action the humans took during that 6-month period was a direct, practical response to the situation they found themselves in. They saw a problem and worked on it, and they didn't stop working on it until it was solved. And then they continued, because when they started working, they found other problems nearby that were also worth solving. She leaned forward. The Sols are very intelligent beings. They are patient, strategic, and have centuries of experience in commercial warfare. What they weren't prepared for was an opponent that looked at their strategy, a strategy specifically designed to create despair and submission, and took it as an interesting challenge. There were smaller stories, and Tessali collected them during the days and weeks that followed her first conversation with Sonora. She found them in fragments and parts, as she had learned to look for things quietly from the sidelines, without asking direct questions that made people clam up. The deep reconnaissance drone of the KRT that was lost due to a navigational error and crossed the border into human space. It returned 3 months later, not just found, but repaired. More than that, upgraded. Several of its systems were enhanced with modifications that KRT engineers who received it didn't recognize and spent the next few years studying. Attached securely to the outside of the drone's hull was a small, sealed container. Inside the container were items that took a while to identify. Small, round, brown, baked items made of a grain product with the addition of a form of processed sugar crystal and what a food chemist at KRT called a fat derivative, likely of animal origin. The note attached to the container read only, "Found your drone, fixed some things, thought you might like it. The station team, Outpost 7. The KRT engineers ate the cookies cautiously, and then, reportedly, ate them all. The drone's modifications were subsequently incorporated into 3 generations of subsequent reconnaissance vessel designs. The KRT story was about a conclave passenger liner that suffered a catastrophic navigational accident near the border and crossed 3 light-years into human space before its emergency systems could stop it. Human ships reached it within hours. They provided electricity, medical aid, and enough supplies for the liner to return home. They took nothing, they asked for nothing. The only thing they asked for was for the liner captain to confirm the names and homeworlds of all the passengers, which, according to Sonora, confused everyone, until someone with sufficient historical knowledge pointed out that humans seemed to be checking if any of their own people were on board. Apparently it was a habit, never leave their own behind if possible. There was a story about an incident on the border near Rich Tinavar, when a conclave reconnaissance patrol misjudged its position in an iron storm and found itself in front of a human defensive station. The patrol captain expected a confrontation. Instead, he received a patient, clear message on an open channel in perfect standard conclave, offering to help the patrol get out of the storm and back into the correct position. The station operator even provided updated meteorological data for the region as a courtesy. None of these stories were in official records. They lived in the personal accounts of those who had been there, passed down from crew to crew over generations, growing slightly with each retelling but never losing their core quality, the quality of something true. It was Sonora, in their third meeting, who gave Tessali the part that tied all the other parts together. "You have been asking the wrong question," Sonora said. "Not unkindly," she said. "The way a good teacher speaks with enough tenderness that it was taken as information, not criticism." Tessali looked at her. "What do you mean? You were asking what humans did that scares the galaxy. You were collecting incidents, the Brett fleet, the Sol embargo, the drone, the liner, and looking for a common threat, a weapon, an ability, something that makes them dangerous." Sonora shook her head. "But the story isn't about that." Tessali waited. "The Brett fleet didn't turn back because humans were too strong to fight. They turned back because they were too exhausting to fight, because fighting them felt like fighting something that simply never ends. And that feeling was scarier than any weapon the humans actually carried." Sonora folded her hands on the table. The souls didn't end their embargo because they were defeated. They ended it because they were outworked by a species that looked at a serious problem and took it as something interesting, not as something hopeless. The drone wasn't returned as a demonstration of power. It was returned because humans found a broken thing, and their instinct was to fix it. The liner wasn't helped because humanity wanted something in return, but because humans were in trouble, and for a human, that is simply a reason to act. She paused. The white ridges on the back of her head turned a little paler. "What is the galaxy afraid of?" she said. "It is not what humans will do to us. It is what they are, how they are wired. They are wired in such a way that it does not include stopping. They don't stop when it's hard. They don't stop when they're losing. They don't stop when they're tired, scared, or vastly outnumbered. They stop when the problem is solved, and not always then, because sometimes they get caught up in the next problem while still finishing the last one." She looked at Tessali with firm eyes. "And the terrible thing is that this isn't aggression. It isn't even ambition, in the way we understand ambition. It is simply how they are. It is what they do. Like water flows downhill, that is what water does. Like humans persist, that is what humans do." And the galaxy looked at that 800 years ago and quietly agreed that everything living behind the gray area was something we should leave alone because we had no framework for interacting with something that simply does not stop. In the tea house, silence reigned for a long time. Tessali thought of Celtivar and the two ships he had seen from the observation deck, which no one wanted him to talk about. She thought of the clean void in the archive where the reason for Directive 1 Prima should have been. She thought of all the small and large stories and how they all pointed in the same direction. "Someone should have talked to them," she finally said after a long time. Sonora looked at her. Her expression was complex, something between agreement and the deep exhaustion of a person who had thought about this for a very long time. "Yes," she said quietly, "someone should have." Outside, the lights of the dock bay were switching to the station's evening cycle, somewhere in the western arm of the galaxy. Behind the gray area on the map, 412 stars revolved around their suns, and the civilization among them was doing what it always did, working, building, solving problems, and waiting, perhaps not even knowing what it was waiting for until the rest of the galaxy finally decided it was ready to come and say hello. Central Station Veraf was the largest station in the Conclave's Western transport network. It sat at the intersection of 7 major trade routes, handled over 300 ship arrivals and departures per standard day, and had a population of about 90 permanent residents, plus a rotating population of travelers, bringing the total to about 150 inches a busy cycle. It was built to handle surprises. It had dock bays capable of receiving ships of almost any configuration. It had a diplomatic wing with translation services in over 2,000 languages. It had security forces, a medical facility, a commercial center, an administrative tower, and a communication relay powerful enough to reach the other side of the known galaxy in less than an hour. Nothing in its construction prepared it for what happened on a perfectly ordinary morning at 6:15 station time. The arrival signal, soft, non-urgent, the kind that triggered 100 times a day, sounded in the control room, and second-class operator Fenris Skull looked up from his terminal to check the approach data of the incoming vessel. He looked at the data. He looked again. He looked around the control room to see if others were watching their screens and found that 2 of his colleagues were watching, and both had frozen. "Fen," his colleague Prate said in a very cautious and controlled voice. "Do you see what I see?" "I see it," Fenris replied. "It's a ship." "It's a ship?" "Yes." "Coming from the side of the western arm?" "Yes." A silence hung in the control room that wasn't really silence, because all the equipment continued to run, but felt like silence because everyone in it had stopped making any sound at all. "It's transmitting," said the third operator, Liz, staring at her screen with her head tilted, as if that might help her understand what she was reading. "Wide spectrum, open channel, all frequencies." She paused. "It's a greeting." The ship that was approaching Central Station Veraf was large enough to be significant, but not large enough to be aggressive. It was built, and this was the first thing the station's analysis systems noted and couldn't categorize precisely, which indicated that it was built by people who were deeply practical and didn't particularly care about its appearance. There were sections that were clearly older than others. There were external modifications, additional armor in some places, additional antenna clusters, equipment housings bolted to the hull that didn't match the rest of the construction, which suggested ongoing modification over time rather than a single planned design. The engine signature was unusual, efficient, clearly powerful, but operating in a configuration that no Conclave ship database could match. The registration code it was broadcasting wasn't contained in any Conclave registry. The language in its greeting was standard Conclave, perfect, clear, completely without accent, which in itself was enough for the translators to sit up straight, because that wasn't what was expected from a species making first contact. First contact species didn't speak your language. First contact species required months of painstaking work on communication before you could exchange even basic information. First contact species weren't supposed to already know you well enough to clearly address you in your language upon their first approach to your station. The greeting read, "Central Station Veraf. This is the vessel. Persistence. Research Service of Humanity from the SOL system. We are approaching on a friendly course and request docking permission. Weapons are in standby. We will be glad to answer questions. Please advise the preferred docking bay." There were 17 people in Control Room 7 when the greeting arrived. By the time the message was confirmed and reread, there were 31, because the news had spread through the control wing in about 90 seconds. Fenris Skull, who was technically the duty officer, spent 45 seconds staring at the message on his screen, and then did the only reasonable thing available to him. He passed the decision to his supervisor, the supervisor of the supervisor, who arrived at Control Room 7 4 minutes later, looking as calm as a person can look when they have just been told that a human ship is requesting a parking space at their station. Director Kess read the message. She read it twice. She looked out the observation window at the approaching shape of Persistence. On the remote display, she scanned the analysis data. She looked at her staff, all of whom were looking at her with an expression that clearly said, "Please, tell us what to do." Director Kess had worked in the station administration for 38 years. She had dealt with engine fires, medical epidemics, diplomatic incidents, dock bay flooding due to a malfunctioning water recycling system, and one memorable case where a merchant brought an uncontrolled sample of a species to the commercial center that turned out to be poisonous and highly mobile. She had never encountered anything like this. "Assign them Bay 47, she said, because Bay 47 was large, isolated, had its own atmosphere systems, and was far enough from the main living sections to give everyone some space. Connect me to the diplomatic wing. Connect me to the chief of security and tell Tessali Vone." Tessali was in her office in the cartography department. When the message came, and she arrived at the observation level of Bay 47 at about the same time, Persistence completed its docking approach. She had been expecting something like this in a way. She knew it would happen not in the sense of a prophecy, but in the simple, logical sense that when you pull a thread long enough, whatever it is tied to eventually appears. She had been pulling threads for 8 months. She had pieced together a file from fragments, stories, and second-hand accounts and the memories of old diplomats. And she realized, as she suspected not many around her had yet realized, that the gray area was not a stable situation. Things kept secret don't stay secret forever. They stay secret until they don't. And the moment they stop being a secret, they stop very suddenly and completely. What she hadn't fully expected was this. Persistence lowered into Bay 47 with the easy confidence of a ship whose crew had done this thousands of times. The docking clamps locked, the cycle airlock, the bay's atmosphere processors hummed, equalizing pressure and composition. And then the airlock opened, and Commander Eli Marsh stepped out. He was, by any measure Tessali expected to apply, unremarkable. He was of average height, shorter than her, though Tankas tended to be tall among bipeds. He was broader in the shoulders than most species she had dealt with, which she knew was a common human characteristic, but he was less imposing in person than in the biological reports she had read. He had short-cropped dark hair and a face weathered the way faces become when they spend a lot of time on ships and in places with variable atmospheres. He was carrying a large mug with a handle, the contents of which were slightly steaming in the bay air, and he was wearing a dark jacket with a hole along the left sleeve that had been roughly repaired at some point and then partially torn again. He stepped out of the airlock and stopped. On the observation level above Bay 47, within 11 minutes of the announcement of his arrival over the station's internal network, between 300 and 400 people had gathered. Not security staff. They were present, but standing at a distance per Director Kess's instructions. Just residents, travelers, and workers who had heard that a human ship was docking at Bay 47 and had decided that whatever they were doing was less important than seeing this. Marsh looked at them. They looked at him. He looked around the bay. He looked at the airlock he had just come out of. He looked at the security staff standing at a respectful and very cautious distance. He looked again at the observation gallery of several hundred aliens who were watching him in complete, deep, barely controlled silence. He raised his mug in what Tessali recognized from her readings as a human gesture of greeting. "Hello," he said in standard conclave language, in a calm, clear voice that carried effortlessly across the bay. "We noticed that no one visits. We thought we would come say hello." He paused and looked around the bay again, apparently checking if there was a customs form he should fill out. The next 4 hours were the most carefully orchestrated chaos Central Station Verov had ever produced. Director Kess handled it with the firm efficiency of a person who understood that the right response to unprecedented situations was to apply very normal procedures to them as quickly as possible, because normal procedures calmed everyone involved, including the unprecedented situation itself. Marsh was escorted at a distance that started at 10 meters and gradually, cautiously shortened to the diplomatic wing, where he was met by second-rank Ambassador Dorel D.E., who had served on Veraf for 6 years and was considered usually imperturbable. D sat opposite Marsh at the diplomatic table and, for the first time in his career, found himself perturbed. Tessali got into the room the simple way, by telling 3 different people that someone else had already authorized her presence. It wasn't strictly ethical. She wasn't strictly regretful. She sat at the far end of the table and watched. Marsh set his mug on the table. The table, which was an antique piece of conclave diplomatic furniture, was worth more than most small ships and had never seen a mug in its entire history, and looked at Ambassador D with a direct, open expression that Tessali carefully catalogued. He wasn't nervous. That was the first thing. He wasn't playing calm, he was actually calm, in the deep sense of a person for whom this situation, however unusual it might be, was simply a problem to be solved. And problems were what he was used to. He had lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time in expressions of concentration or amusement. And at the moment, it wasn't entirely clear which was active. "I want to be perfectly clear from the beginning," he said to Ambassador D. "We are not here to make demands, issue statements, or start something that requires a treaty. I am specifically authorized to conduct a conversation, and no more. The conversation can be about anything." He looked around the room. "Although I noticed you have a cartographer in the background there, so I assume some of this will concern the map." Every head in the room turned to Tessali. Tessali felt all 4 of her eyes widen. "We know about the gray area," Marsh said, not taking his eyes off the ambassador, but with a tone that suggested he was fully aware of the cartographer's reaction. "We have known for quite a while. At first we found it funny, then a bit sad, then we just left it as it was because it seemed you needed it that way, and we had other things to do." He picked up his mug and took a sip. "But there is this generational phenomenon. I think whoever lived when the initial decision was made had a reason for the rule. They understand why. But 10 generations later, you have people. The next rule, the reasons for which no one remembers. And that is when everything starts to go wrong. Because a rule without a reason is just a habit, and habits are harder to fix than a decision." Ambassador D regained his composure enough to ask, "Are you suggesting that the current situation, the arrangement regarding the border, is unstable?" "I am suggesting that it is a little silly," Marsh said graciously. "No offense. I am sure those who established it had good reasons. But now you have, 40 million species in the conclave, and each of them avoids the gray area on the map? Not very. That, understanding why, and we on the other side of that gray area doing the same, and it would be genuinely useful for everyone if we just talked." He paused. "Besides, we keep catching some of your distress signals from ships that get into trouble near the border, and we keep helping. But we are forced to do it secretly, and it is becoming logistically difficult." A long silence followed. "You help vessels in trouble," Ambassador D said slowly. "Secretly for about a century," Marsh confirmed. "It is a small operation. If someone is in trouble and is nearby, we help. It seemed right." He looked at the slightly puzzled expression on the ambassador's face. "It's a problem." Tessali left the meeting 3 hours later with a head full of things to organize. She went to the small lounge of the cartography department, made herself a drink, sat down, and wrote a list. The list had 2 columns. The first column was called What I Expected, the second, What Actually Happened. The first column was long. It had points about difficult negotiations, veiled threats, and careful diplomatic language, as well as the exchange of information that characterized every first contact in Conclave history. The second column had one point. He asked about a customs form. He said it would be useful for everyone. She stared at the two columns for a while. She thought of everything Sonora had told her, and the stories she had collected over 8 months, and Directive 1 Prima, and the clean void in the archive, and the 412 stars behind the gray area. She thought of what Sonora had said. What is the galaxy afraid of? It is not what they will do to us. It is what they are. She understood the sentence when Sonora said it. She thought she understood it completely. But sitting in the lounge with a list that had only one point in the second column, she understood it better. Because what made Eli Marsh quietly, genuinely, fundamentally disturbing wasn't that he was intimidating. It was that he was completely ordinary. He was a human sitting at a diplomatic table, drinking something hot from a mug with a torn sleeve, asking practical questions, and making practical observations, and being, in all visible respects, just a human who had a job, and he was doing it. And somewhere behind the gray area on the map were billions just like him, all working, all persisting, all looking at the gray areas of the galaxy, its empty spaces, its avoided questions, its rules without reason, calmly and reasonably asking if it wouldn't be useful to actually talk about it. Tessali finished her drink, put the list aside, and went back to the diplomatic wing. She had questions, and for the first time in 8 months, there was someone she could ask directly. In the diplomatic wing of Central Station Varaf, there were 12 conference rooms. They ranged from large formal chambers with high ceilings and symbolic lighting intended to convey equal status between delegations, to small, simple rooms with round tables and no decorations at all, which were used for conversations that needed to be honest, not ceremonial. Eli Marsh chose one of the small rooms. He said he preferred round tables because no one had to sit at the head and spend half the meeting wondering what that meant. Ambassador D looked at him for a long time after that statement with the expression of a diplomat who had spent 30 years dealing with the meaning of table geometry and was now being asked to set all of that aside. He did so with grace and joined Marsh at the round table, and Tessali sat down, both with her recorder and a 4-page list of questions, the first of which she had rewritten 14 times to ensure it wouldn't sound wrong, and she still asked it, and it sounded slightly wrong, which, she suspected, was inevitable. "How long have you known?" she said. Marsh looked at her. It was, as she had noticed over the past day, a specific kind of look, not unfriendly but very direct, which communicated that the person behind it was watching carefully and wasn't going to pretend he wasn't. "How long have we known about the conclave? About the gray area? About the fact that we intentionally excluded you from the map?" He thought for a moment, which she appreciated because it meant he was truly considering the question, not giving her a prepared answer. "Officially, about 300 years. There is an entry in our public archives about an astronomer who noticed that the traffic of reconnaissance probes from the galactic east had ceased, and the last probe came from a certain direction, and then there were no more. He figured out that someone had made a decision to stop coming and filed a report to what was then our government." He took a sip from his constant mug. "The report didn't cause a crisis. People talked about it for a while, and then went back to work, which is what we tend to do. It didn't scare anyone. Some people worried about it. There was a theory, for a time, that we had done something wrong, that you had found us dangerous and decided to isolate us. That theory had a solid basis for a generation or two, but it didn't hold up, because if you had wanted to isolate us, you would have done something more active than just not returning. You just stopped, and stopping seemed more like retreating than surrounding." He tilted his head. "It seemed that we had scared you with something, and that seemed strange to us because, from our perspective, we were the ones who were outnumbered. Tessali wrote something down, but you still didn't come to find out." "Officially, no. We were busy," he said simply, without apology or irony. And Tessali believed him completely, because she had spent 8 months studying what humanity had been doing in its 412 star systems for the last centuries. And the answer was, a lot. We had planets to settle, systems to develop, many internal problems to solve, and there was a feeling, not politics, just a feeling that everything on the other side of the line had decided it didn't want to meet us. And pushing people who don't want to be pushed is not something we needed to do. "And the ships you were helping?" He shrugged slightly. That was never official policy either. Just, if you see someone in trouble and you can help them, you help. Some of our people near the border made that decision individually over the years, and it became a habit. We never announced it because we thought it would cause more problems than it solved. The conversation went on for 2 hours, and Tessali asked questions, and Ambassador D asked questions, and Marsh answered everything with the same direct, relaxed honesty that she was beginning to think was just his way of communicating, not a diplomatic technique, not a style of practice, but a sincere preference for saying real things, not a safe version of things. She asked about the Brett fleet. He nodded slowly. We knew it was coming even before it crossed the border. Long-range detection. There was a lot of internal debate about what to do. He paused. Some people wanted to send a diplomatic signal before their arrival. Some people wanted to wait and see if they would stop at the border. Some people wanted to immediately prepare a full military response. He looked at his mug. The people who wanted to wait won the argument, and the Bretts didn't stop at the border. So the military response happened anyway. 4,000 warships, Ambassador D said quietly. That was a big fleet, Marsh agreed. We had fewer. We had people who understood the territory and had a reason to be there, which the Bretts didn't, and who were ready to keep going past the point where a rational calculation would have suggested stopping. He remained silent. We don't like losing people. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a glorious affair. It was ugly and costly. And on 16 worlds there are memorials that list the names. He looked up. But the alternative was losing the systems where those people lived, and the people who were there, and everything they were building. And that was unacceptable. He looked up. So they didn't stop. And in the end, the Bretts decided that continuing wasn't worth it. The note read, "Please do not do this again." Marsh nodded. That was written by the ship commander, Hanayu. She was on a ground operation on the 3rd planet. When the Brett fleet began its retreat, she found the ship they were using to transport prisoners, freed the prisoners, put them back on the Brett ship, and wrote that note herself. She had very neat handwriting, as it turned out. It is in a museum now. He paused. She thought it was important to be polite. She said, "It is not worth humiliating people more than necessary when they are leaving anyway." Ambassador D looked as if this information was doing something complicated to his understanding of the universe. She thought about their feelings after they had invaded. She was exactly that kind of person. Marsh finally asked the question she had been preparing for. Not a question about the Brett fleet or the Sol embargo or the drone or any of the specific incidents she had been collecting for months. The question under all those questions, the one Sonora had told her to ask as the right one in the tea house on the day all this began. "Who are you?" she said. "Not politically, not in a military way. Who are humans in a sense that will help me understand why an entire galaxy decided to leave you alone?" Marsh remained silent for longer than he had for any previous question. He set his mug down and looked at it for a moment, and she had the feeling he wasn't feigning thoughtfulness. He was truly thinking, turning the question over, examining it from different angles. "There is a word we use," he finally said. "Persistence. It means not stopping when it's hard. Not because you don't realize it's hard, not because you don't feel it, but because the work you are working on is more important than the difficulty. And so you continue." He looked up. "Every species is persistent about something, but for humans, it has less to do with a specific case and more to do with everything. We get interested in something and don't stop being interested. We make a promise and keep keeping it, even when it becomes inconvenient. We encounter a problem, and something in us turns toward it, not away from it." He leaned back slightly. "Another thing is that we are curious in a way that this curiosity doesn't switch off. There are species that are curious until the case becomes dangerous, and then the curiosity stops because survival outweighs it. For humans, and I say this honestly, not boastfully, danger doesn't extinguish curiosity. It changes it. It makes curiosity more focused. A person who is told, 'That's dangerous, don't go there,' is likely to want to understand why. And that desire is stronger than fear." He paused. "This has historically led us into many problems. It has also helped us get out of many problems. Because the same impulse that leads you to danger is the same impulse that makes you work on a solution after everyone else has given up." Tessali wrote. Ambassador D was very calm. "Is that why you are here?" D asked. "Curiosity. Partly," Marsh said. "And partly because there are 800 years of missed conversations, and someone had to start. We thought, why not us? We are good at starting things." He picked up his mug. "Besides, We kept catching some of your fragmentary signals from your side of the border, which suggested that someone there had found some of our old survey files and started asking questions. We thought, if someone is brave enough to ask questions, the least we can do is show up to answer them. He looked directly at Tessali. She had all four eyes on him. You caught my research signals, she said. We are very good at listening, he said. They were silent. In the days that followed, a pattern established itself that no one had planned and no one knew how to manage. Marsh was not confined to the diplomatic wing. This was Director Kess's decision, based on the logic that restricting him would imply that they were afraid of him, and the assumption that they were afraid of him seemed like a dynamic that was better to avoid. Therefore, he was provided with a guest room, a general pass, and a polite request to inform someone if he intended to leave the station, and he was allowed to go anywhere in the common areas of Central Veraf. He walked everywhere, not aggressively, not inquisitively. He moved about the station with the easy manner of a person genuinely interested in his environment, and he made no special effort to hide it. He asked questions of everyone who seemed willing to answer. About the station's systems, about the trade routes that passed through it, about the history of the Drenvar system, about what different species eat and what they do, and what their home worlds look like from orbit. He didn't ask broad questions. He asked specific, thoughtful questions, listened carefully to the answers, and then asked better follow-up questions. Furthermore, as those around him quickly discovered, he was fixing things. It all started small. The water recycling system in the living area, which had been making a strange sound for 3 weeks. He heard it, asked what it was, identified the sound by a specific connection node, borrowed a maintenance worker's tool who happened to be passing by, and fixed the connection in about 4 minutes. The maintenance worker watched this with the expression of a person who had been planning to deal with that connection node for 3 weeks and felt simultaneously grateful and vaguely outperformed. Then it was the cargo analysis software in the commercial section, which was giving a recurring error in weight calculations. Marsh happened to be there when a dock worker was looking at the error message with the expression of a person who had been fighting the machine all day and losing. He looked at the screen, asked 2 questions, and identified the source of the calculation error, not a software problem, but a calibration problem in the sensor module that was feeding data into the software, which no one had thought to check because the software's error message pointed to the software itself. Then it was the navigation display in the public transport section, which was showing slightly incorrect route times due to a relay station that had drifted from its mapped position. Marsh noticed this because he was looking at the display, waiting for a transit module, noticed that the times were wrong based on what he knew of the transit distances involved, asked the nearest station worker about it, and the station worker passed the information on, and the relay station was corrected within a day. He keeps fixing things, Director Kess said to Tessali with a tone that wasn't quite a complaint and not quite admiration. And somewhere in between? I know, Tessali said. No one asked him to fix them. I know. He just sees them and fixes them. It is, she said cautiously, how they work. On the 5th day, Marsh asked if he could see the cartography department. Tessali took him herself. She showed him the current databases, active research projects, cartographic displays that showed the known galaxy in all its detail. He looked at everything with the special attention he gave everything that interested him, and he spoke very little, and she allowed him to look without rushing him. Finally, he stopped before a large main display, the one that showed the entire western arm with the gray area sitting in its corner like a missing tooth in a smile. He stood before it for a long time. Strange, he finally said, seeing ourselves on a map as a gray void. I'm sorry, Tessali said. She meant it. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't offended, just human in that complex sense in which she was learning the word worked. No need. I understand. From the outside, we must look unpredictable, perhaps a bit unsettling. If I were mapping a region and didn't understand what was in it, I would probably leave it gray. He looked at the display again. But it would be better with stars. Yes, she said. It would. He remained silent. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small data chip. He handed it to her. Our survey data, he said. 412 systems, each star named. Each habitable world cataloged. Atmospheric data, population estimates, resource surveys, the entire record we have. It's not classified. Anyone can get it. He looked at the gray area. It would be a pity if it remained gray. Tessali took the chip very carefully with both her front hands. as one takes something that has come after a long wait. "I will make sure it gets to the right people," she said. "I know you will," he said. "That's why I gave it to you, not the ambassador." On the 7th day, Sonora arrived at the station. Tessali had sent her a message, 3 lines, carefully written, which read, "Only the question was answered. I think you should come and meet the answer." Sonora arrived the next morning by early transit and found Tessali waiting for her at the docking gate with an expression that was hard to read, but Sonora, who read people well, immediately and correctly interpreted it. "How I was right. And I knew it. And I am trying very hard not to say it." Tessali brought her to the small room with the round table where Marsh was eating something he had obtained from the station's food service and reading something on a small, portable screen. He looked up when they entered. He looked at Sonora for a moment with those attentive eyes. "You knew all along," he said, "that she had been carrying this for a long time." Sonora stood very quietly. "You know about me? We caught fragments. You served at the border at the beginning of your career. You have been doing cautious, quiet work on this for decades. We noticed." He stood up and held out his hand, a human gesture of greeting, which Sonora, who had done her homework, recognized and accepted, shaking his hand the way he offered it. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting this be forgotten." Sonora looked at him for a long time. The white ridges on her neck went through 3 different shades in succession, which Tessali interpreted as the equivalent of a very emotional reaction in a tanka, which was very carefully controlled. "I had a colleague once," Sonora finally said, "long ago. She told me that some things remain quiet not because they have to, but because everyone around them is afraid. And she said that the only answer to this is not to be afraid to keep asking." She paused. "I haven't always been brave enough," but I continued. Marsh looked at her with a warm and sincere, completely uncomplicated expression. "That," he said, "is the most human thing I have ever heard from someone who is not human." The data chip that Eli Marsh handed to Tessali Vone was about the size of her fingernail. It weighed almost nothing. She put it on her desk when she returned to the cartography department that evening and sat opposite it for a long time, just looking at it. 412 star systems on a piece of material that she could lose in a coat pocket. She transferred the data to the Cartographers Guild secure server and submitted an official receipt report, which was standard procedure for receiving new survey data. The receipt form asked for the data source. She wrote, "Human Research Service, Human Space, SOL System." She hit send. The response came in 40 minutes, which was faster than the standard processing time. And it came from 3 levels higher than it should have. A recognition that told her someone in the senior administration of cartographers had been monitoring the flag on her account ever since news of Persistence's arrival in Bay 47 became known. The response read, "Please hold these data pending review by the Senior Review Committee." Tessali looked at the response. Then she looked at 8 months of work piled into her personal files, at the fragments from the archive station, at Sonora's stories, at the fragments of old diplomatic notes and surveyor journals and personal diary entries, at all the parts of the real story that had been behind the gray area, waiting for someone to put them together. She replied, "Understood." Awaiting review process. The response was non-committal. She closed the response window and did what she had learned from Eli Marsh. She put aside the part of the problem she couldn't move now and found the part she could. She began to build a new map. It wasn't simple work. Survey data from an independent civilization didn't just fall into the Conclave database without significant processing. Coordinate systems needed to be reconciled. Nomenclature of names needed to be standardized, or at least cross-referenced. Marsh had told her that humans had their own names for almost everything and that they tended to be either very practical, second settlement, new harbor, or deeply strange by non-human standards. Threshold, sorrow, the place where we tried again. Data on atmosphere and population needed to be formatted to Conclave standards. Tessali spent 2 weeks on this work, while the Senior Review Committee met and debated and sent her cautious, formal messages with cautious, formal questions. She answered the questions carefully. She provided her documentation. She sent copies of the archive files she had received from the archive station, including the original survey data and the original text of Directive 1 Prima. She also, through channels she didn't advertise, sent copies to Sonora and several historians and diplomats in other conclave institutions whom she trusted for their months of research. Not because she was planning anything, but because, having watched the gray area for 8 months, she had learned that information existing in only one place has a habit of disappearing. Marsh, for his part, was still at the station. His authorized stay had been extended 3 times by Director Kess, who initially seemed unsure of his presence, and gradually moved to a position that very much resembled finding him useful. The water recycler connection node was the beginning. The list of things he had identified and fixed since then had grown. And he also, in his direct and practical way, began asking questions about the larger systems of the station cargo routing algorithms, docking planners, atmosphere management protocols, with that special quality of attention that suggested he wasn't just interested in how they worked, but was looking for ways they could work better. He never insisted, he never demanded. He just looked at things, thought about them, and then, in a conversational manner, mentioned what he had noticed, and what, in his opinion, was worth considering. Director Kess, 3 weeks after this, quietly granted him an unofficial advisory role, and then spent a full day pretending she hadn't. "He has been here for 4 weeks, Ambassador D said to Tessali during a hallway meeting that was actually a scheduled consultation disguised as a coincidence. "He shows no signs of wanting to leave." "He is working," Tessali said. "On what?" She thought about it. "On things that need doing." The Senior Review Committee issued its conclusion after 3 weeks of deliberations. The conclusion was long, formal, and written in the dense administrative language of conclave official documentation. Tessali read it in less than an hour, which was fast only because she skipped straight to the findings section and then worked backward through the justification only as needed. The committee concluded that the survey data submitted by the Human Research Service was authentic. It established that the coordinate work and formatting performed by Tessali were correct and sound. It established that there were no technical obstacles to including the data in the Conclave's standard cartographic database. And then it noted, in cautious and measured language, that the decision to update public maps with this data was not a cartographic decision. It was a political decision, and it had to be made by the Conclave High Council. Tessali forwarded the conclusion to Senora, who forwarded it to 3 council members she knew personally, with a cover letter that Tessali had helped write. And this was the most carefully crafted document Tessali had ever participated in creating. Each sentence was checked for how it could be misinterpreted. Each argument was checked against counter-arguments that could be used against it. Senora had 40 years of diplomatic experience, and Tessali had 8 months of obsessive research. And together, they created a document that was very difficult to argue with. It took the council 11 days. During those 11 days, Tessali finished the new map. She finished it completely. Each system named, each star named both by the Human Research Service Convention and the standard conclave language. Each habitable world marked with its population estimate and main industries and the name it used for itself. She added the trade routes that Marsh had described, FTL lines that humanity had developed independently and used among its own systems for decades. She built the map in full resolution, the type of resolution the Conclave Cartographers Guild used for its premium published maps, the ones that hung in public buildings and government offices and on the observation decks of major stations, large enough to be read from afar. She also left the gray area. She left it as a reference, a ghost of the old map, faintly visible under the new data, so that anyone looking at it could see both what had been there before and what was actually there. She thought it was important not to forget the gray area, to remember it as a choice that had been made for complex reasons and had held for 800 years. And finally, thanks to the slow and careful work, it was laid to rest. The decision of the Conclave High Council came on a Tuesday, which was not a significant day in any species calendar. It was released as an official administrative update, the same routine announcement that was sent out dozens of times a day over the Conclave communication network, updating policies, clarifying procedures, issuing routine directives. This announcement rescinded Directive 1 Prima without ceremony, without announcements, without a press conference or public statement. Just a short administrative notice that stated the directive had been rescinded and that the resources of the Cartographers Guild were authorized to update the standard maps, reflecting the current survey data for the Western Spiral Arm region. That was all. 800 years of the gray area. And it ended with 2 paragraphs in an administrative notice. Tessali was in her office when it arrived. She read it twice. She sat for a moment. Then she opened the map she had built and marked it for publication. She sent a copy to Senora. She walked 2 hallways to Marsh's office. He had an unofficial place in the logistics department. Now a small room with a round table that, as Director Kess claimed, was not permanent, but which had somehow accumulated a full set of tools and a second chair and a second mug clearly intended for guests, and knocked on the open door. Marsh looked up from what he was working on. "The directive has been rescinded," she said. He looked at her. In his expression, something changed. Not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter than both. "Good," he said. "The map goes out tomorrow. Full distribution across the Conclave network. Every station, every ship, every terminal." He nodded slowly. "Do you want to see it?" she asked before it went out. He put aside what he was working on and stood up. She showed it to him on the main display of the cartography department, the same display they had stood before on the day he gave her the chip, which showed the gray area in the corner like a missing tooth. The gray area was gone. In its place, the western spiral arm was fully populated with stars, hundreds of them, bright and named, and connected by routes and lines and small notes that told the story of a civilization that had been quietly building for centuries. Human space was no longer empty. It was a place, fully real, fully mapped, fully present on the map of the known galaxy. Exactly like everything else. Marsh stood before it for a long time. Tessali stood beside him and said nothing, because there are moments that belong to the person experiencing them, and the best thing you can do is give them space. He raised his hand and lightly touched the edge of the display with 2 fingers, the stars near the center of the human systems. The display identified it. Yellow star. The first one that the early Conclave surveyors found 1,000 years ago, when the signal from the third planet caught their attention and started the whole long story. "Earth," he said quietly. "Earth," she replied. He remained silent for another moment. Then he lowered his hand and looked at her. And in his expression was something simple and direct and very human in that special sense in which, she had learned, the word worked. Not complex or hidden, but simply a sincere feeling, clearly felt. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving it gray." "Thank you," she said, "for coming to say hello." The new map went out over the Conclave network the next morning at the beginning of the first hour of the standard cycle, arriving at terminals, displays, and public maps across hundreds of star systems simultaneously, as is the way with important updates. Most of the people who saw it that day noticed only a small change in the region of the western arm that had previously been unexplored. Many of them looked at it for a moment and moved on, because they had work and it was early morning. Some looked longer. A navigation officer on a long-haul freighter from the Ridge Systems looked at the update for several minutes before calling her captain, and the captain came over and stared. And then they stood together looking at the western arm and all its new stars, and they said nothing for a long time, because there was a lot one could say, and nowhere to begin. A history professor at the Conclave's largest university called 3 of his colleagues before he finished his morning drink and spent the next 4 hours on calls that were constantly interrupted by other calls from other people who also saw the map and wanted to talk about it. An elderly member of the Brett Diplomatic Service, 93 years old and retired, saw the map on a public display in the commons room of her living block and sat down on the nearest chair and didn't move for a long time. She had been a junior diplomatic aide when she was young enough to have once spoken to a diplomat who had once spoken to someone who was in the room when the fleet returned with the note. She had carried this story her whole life, turning it over from time to time, pondering it. She looked at the map for a long time and thought of the note and of the ship commander with the neat handwriting who thought it was important to be polite. And she thought, 800 years. It took us 800 years. And then she thought, better late than never. The official protocols for Conclave first contact with human space were established over the next 18 months in a careful and deliberate manner, as is done with important things. Trade agreements were signed, diplomatic missions were established, FTL routes between human space and the Conclave's eastern networks were mapped and certified. Humans, true to everything Tessali had learned about them, didn't wait for the final protocol arrangements before intervening. Human engineers showed up at Conclave infrastructure projects before anyone had officially invited them, looking at the systems with interested eyes and graciously mentioning that they had a couple of ideas. Human traders showed up at border stations with goods that turned out to be in high demand and competitively priced. After conducting a preliminary market study, human explorers applied to explore regions the Conclave had marked as too dangerous to explore, apparently finding that description more interesting than discouraging. The Conclave adapted. It didn't have much of a choice, but the adaptation wasn't unhappy. which the historians who later wrote about this period noted with interest. There was no conflict, crisis, moment of confrontation, or threat. The gray area became a door, and the door opened, and on the other side was a civilization of persistent, curious, relentlessly helpful people who had been waiting for a conversation for a long time and were very ready to start it. Tessali Vone was promoted twice in the year after the map update. She wasn't particularly looking for promotions, but she didn't refuse them, because they gave her more spacious offices and better access. And both those factors were useful. She continued working on the frontier regions. There was still a lot of cartographic work to be done in the Western Arm, and she was the best specialist in the guild. She collaborated with the Human Research Service on a joint research project that mapped 11 previously unexplored systems along the old border corridor. She wrote 2 widely cited articles, though she was better at writing articles than reading citations, and rarely checked them. She kept in touch with Sonora, who consulted on the early diplomatic base and soon after retired, sending occasional messages from wherever she was traveling, which was usually somewhere interesting, and usually included searching for some old record or fragment that needed to be understood. She kept in touch with Marsh, who didn't stay at Central Station Varaf forever. Eventually, he submitted his report to the Human Research Service, was briefly recalled to Seoul for what he described as many meetings, and then sent out again on persistence with an expanded mission to continue what had officially become the largest human diplomatic engagement in centuries. He sent her data from time to time, not personal messages. He wasn't a particularly expressive communicator in writing, but survey data, notes on systems he had passed, random observations about things he had noticed in conclave space that seemed worth pondering. She sent him corrections to his coordinate designations, because he had a persistent habit of using the Human Research Service system when the conclave standard would have been cleaner, and she was a cartographer, and that professionally bothered her. The map Tessali had built was published by the Conclave Cartographers Guild in a full print edition 6 months after its digital distribution. The print edition was a full-format map of the type made for display, not for folding. On heavy material that would last a long time, she received a copy. She hung it in a frame in her office. It was the first map of the entire known galaxy that included human space at the correct scale, with all 412 systems named and mapped and located in the Western Arm in their correct positions, connected to the rest of the galaxy by routes and lines and the invisible threads of a civilization that had been there all along, quietly working, waiting for the gray area to become a place. In the bottom right corner of the map, under the legend and the guild seal, the designation that had once bordered the gray area had been updated where it used to read, Region Unexplored, Surveyor Access Suspended. SMM Directive 1, Prima of the Conclave. Now it read, Human Space. Border Notification. They will help you if you ask. They will also help you if you don't ask. It is simply what they do. She looked at the map on the day it arrived, standing before it with her morning drink, thinking of 8 months on an archive station and old files and a drive in her jacket pocket and all the slow, careful work that had led to that specific Tuesday afternoon when she noticed something she hadn't noticed before in the bottom left corner of the map, under the wind rose, in a small white space next to the scale line. There was an inscription, small, neat, done with a dark marker directly on the printed surface of the map, not printed as part of the design, written by hand after the fact on the very physical copy she had received. She set her drink down and leaned close. It said, Good work on the map. Took you long enough, E. Marsh. She had no idea how it got there. She didn't ask. She stepped back and looked at the map. Everything, the entire known galaxy with human space, occupying its correct place in the Western Arm, fully real, fully mapped, fully part of the picture. She never took it down.